Dysfunction Files, Episode 64, 7 Days Without Sleep. Medical Mystery Files, Case 15, The Medical Mystery of What Happens When Reality Breaks. Some of the most frightening medical mysteries don't happen in hospitals. They happen in ordinary places, to ordinary people, without warning. In September of 2024, a small community in eastern Kentucky was rocked by a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. A sheriff, a judge, two men known throughout the same county, two men elected by the same voters, two men whose lives have been woven into the fabric of the same community for years. And according to the people who knew them, they weren't enemies. They weren't even casual acquaintances. They were friends. Sheriff Mickey Steins, Judge Kevin Mullins. One afternoon inside the county courthouse, something happened that would send shockwaves through the community for years to come and eventually make national headlines. Early afternoon, security cameras captured the sheriff calmly walking into the judge's chambers, gesturing him to be seated in his chair, unholstering his firearm, and by most accounts, emptying his entire clip as Mullins fell to the floor. Moments later, the judge was dead. And what happened next would leave an entire community searching for answers. Because the facts of what happened that day are not in dispute. The video footage is clear. Sheriff Mickey Steins didn't flee the scene. He didn't run from authorities. Instead, he immediately surrendered to officers. He has sat behind bars without bond every day since. The events of that day are pretty open and closed, not really a whodunit. But that's where the story becomes something far stranger. It was the days leading up to the incident that raised the most questions. According to testimony presented during legal proceedings, Sheriff Mickey Steins had not slept in 7 days. 7 consecutive days. Not a stressful week, not a few restless nights. 7 days and 7 nights without sleep. Family members described a man who had become increasingly paranoid, increasingly fearful, increasingly disconnected from the person they knew. A man pacing through the night, watching security cameras, unable to rest, unable to stop, unable to sleep. On the night before the incident, he went to stay at his Aunt Sherry's house as to not disrupt his sleeping wife and daughter. No advanced warning or phone call, but that wasn't unusual. Aunt Sherry said Mickey knew he was always welcome. It was like his second home. With him, he brought the Benadryl tablets and melatonin gummies prescribed to him by the doctor he saw earlier that day. A proposed solution to his insomnia. 2 over-the-counter medications anyone could purchase from a CVS or Walgreens. After eating nothing for dinner, Aunt Sherry said she watched Mickey take a Benadryl and a melatonin gummy. Then a second, then a third, maybe a fourth. She encouraged him to go lay down in the other room and get some sleep. He tried, but could only lay down for a few minutes until he was up again, pacing the floors, checking the rooms, checking the home security camera feeds on his phone, asking her to drive him back to his house to check on things, on the safety of his wife and daughter. That wasn't like Mickey. Not at all. Neither Sheriff Steins nor Aunt Sherry slept a wink that night. But as darkness turned into sunrise, Mickey left for work the next morning. Sherry said her parents raised Mickey as their own son, and Mickey had a nickname for her mother. He called her Mommy Bones. A few hours into the foggy day following the previous sleepless night came a FaceTime call. Aunt Sherry picked up. It was Mickey. He said, "Sherry?" And she said, "Yes?" He said, "Let me speak to Bones." Aunt Sherry was confused. She asked him to repeat himself. Let me speak to Bones. There was just one problem. Mommy Bones had been dead for 2.5 years. And according to Aunt Sherry, Mickey knew that. He had been there. He had watched her die. He wasn't reminiscing. He wasn't telling a story. He wasn't talking about the past. According to that testimony, he wanted to speak to her, as though she were still alive, just sitting in the other room. For decades, scientists believed sleep deprivation mostly made people tired, irritable, forgetful, distracted. But modern research paints a much darker picture, because prolonged sleep deprivation can do far more than just make us sleepy. It can impair judgment, distort perception, fuel paranoia, trigger hallucinations, and in extreme cases, produce symptoms that can resemble psychosis, a temporary fracture between the brain and reality itself. Now, ultimately, a court will decide what happened in Kentucky. A jury will decide what happened in that courthouse. And none of us can know with certainty what was occurring inside another person's mind. But the story raises a fascinating question, one that affects every single one of us. How important is sleep? Because if 7 days without sleep can potentially change the way a person experiences reality, maybe sleep isn't just another wellness habit. Maybe it's one of the most important biological functions we have. I'm Dr. Kristen Lindgren, and welcome back to the Dysfunction Files. This is Case 15 in our Medical Mystery Files series. This week we're talking about sleep, insomnia, sleep deprivation, the biology of consciousness, and why researchers continue exploring compounds like DSIP and epitalon in the search for better sleep and healthier brains. Because sometimes the line between reality and something else entirely may only be a few nights away. Let's get into it. When the brain stops sleeping. So, before we talk about peptides, before we talk about insomnia, and before we talk about the case itself, we need to answer a very important question. What actually happens when a human being stops sleeping? Because most people think they already know. You stay up too late. You feel tired. You drink more coffee. You power through. End of story. Right? Not exactly. Sleep isn't simply rest. Sleep is active maintenance. It is one of the most complex biological processes occurring inside the human body. Every night, your brain is performing thousands of tasks that you never consciously experience. Memory consolidation, hormone regulation, immune system signaling, metabolic repair, emotional processing, neurotransmitter balancing, waste removal, and perhaps most importantly, reality testing. The ability to accurately interpret and interact with the world around you. When sleep disappears, those systems begin to fail. And the longer sleep is absent, the stranger things become. After about 24 hours awake, most people perform similarly to someone who is legally intoxicated. Reaction time slows. Judgment becomes impaired. Attention suffers. Decision-making deteriorates. And many people begin experiencing emotional instability. Small problems suddenly feel enormous. Patience disappears. Anxiety increases. By 48 hours, things become significantly more serious. Memory begins suffering. Concentration becomes difficult. Mood swings become common. The brain starts struggling to maintain normal cognitive performance. And many people begin experiencing brief involuntary lapses called microsleeps. Tiny episodes lasting seconds. Moments where the brain simply shuts off despite your best efforts to stay awake. The terrifying part? most people don't realize they're even happening. By 72 hours, reality itself can begin to change. Visual distortions, auditory disturbances, paranoia, confusion, difficulty distinguishing perception from fact. The brain starts generating errors, and those errors can become increasingly difficult to recognize. But perhaps the most famous example of prolonged wakefulness happened in 1964. A 17-year-old high school student named Randy Gardner decided to participate in a science fair experiment. His goal? Stay awake as long as humanly possible. Not something I'd recommend. But Randy did it. For 11 days. More than 260 consecutive hours without sleep. And researchers carefully documented what happened. At first, he seemed relatively normal. Tired, irritable, fatigued. Exactly what you would expect. Then things started getting strange. His memory worsened. His concentration deteriorated. His mood became unpredictable. And eventually he began experiencing perceptual disturbances and symptoms consistent with severe sleep deprivation. The remarkable part? After finally sleeping, most of those symptoms resolved. His brain recovered. But the experiment demonstrated something important. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make us tired. It changes the way the brain functions. Now here's where things become especially interesting. Because modern neuroscience suggests that many of the symptoms seen during prolonged sleep deprivation overlap with conditions we normally think of as psychiatric illness. Hallucinations, paranoia, delusions, disorganized thinking, emotional instability. In some cases, this distinction can become surprisingly difficult to make. Researchers have even described severe sleep deprivation as producing a state that can resemble temporary psychosis. Not because someone is permanently mentally ill, but because the brain has been deprived of one of its most essential biological requirements: sleep. And while we don't know exactly what happened inside that Kentucky courthouse, testimony suggests that by the time those final hours arrived, sleep had been absent for nearly a week, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if sleep isn't simply something that helps us feel better? What if it's one of the things keeping us anchored to reality itself? And that raises another question. If sleep is this important, if it is literally required for the brain to accurately interpret reality, why are so many people struggling to get it? Because the truth is, we may be living in one of the most sleep-deprived periods in human history. And that's where our story starts to become a lot more personal. Why we can't sleep anymore. So if sleep is this important, why are so many people struggling to get it? Because here's the uncomfortable reality. The modern world is almost perfectly designed to disrupt sleep. And most of us participate in it every single day, sometimes without even realizing it. For most of human history, our brains evolved around sunlight. Darkness arrived. Melatonin increased. The body cooled. Sleep came naturally. Morning arrived. Light hit the eyes. Cortisol increased. Energy returned. The cycle repeated itself, day after day, season after season, for thousands of years. Then, in the blink of an evolutionary eye, everything changed. Artificial light, televisions, computers, smartphones, streaming services, social media, 24-hour news cycles, and suddenly our brains found themselves living in an environment they were never designed for. Today, many people spend all day indoors under artificial light, and then spend all evening staring directly into bright screens, the exact opposite of what our circadian biology expects. And while the effects may seem small, they add up, night after night, year after year. Then there's stress. And this is where things get even more interesting. Because biologically speaking, your brain doesn't care whether you're being chased by a bear or checking your email at midnight. Stress is stress. The body responds by increasing cortisol, increasing adrenaline, increasing alertness, preparing for action, preparing for survival. The problem? Those are terrible conditions for sleep. You cannot simultaneously be preparing for danger and preparing for deep restorative sleep. The body chooses one. And unfortunately, modern life often keeps us stuck in the first mode. Then we have alcohol, which is one of the most misunderstood sleep disruptors out there. Many people believe alcohol helps them sleep. And technically, it can make you fall asleep faster, which goes without saying, but that's not the same thing as restorative sleep. Alcohol fragments sleep architecture, reduces REM sleep, increases nighttime awakenings, and often leaves people feeling exhausted despite spending 8 hours in bed. In other words, it can create the illusion of sleep while quietly damaging sleep quality. Then there are the medical issues: sleep apnea, insulin resistance, chronic pain, menopause, perimenopause, thyroid dysfunction, depression, anxiety, chronic infections, inflammation. Even seemingly unrelated conditions can have profound effects on sleep quality. And in functional medicine, we often see additional contributors: mold exposure, tick-borne illness, chronic immune activation, nervous system dysregulation. The body may be exhausted, but exhausted does not always mean capable of sleeping. And maybe that's what makes the Kentucky story so fascinating, because most of us hear about 7 days without sleep and immediately think, that could never happen to me. But sleep problems rarely begin with 7 days. They begin with one bad night, then another, then another. Weeks become months, months become years, and little by little, people start accepting a level of exhaustion that was never supposed to be normal. And then there's a problem that almost nobody talks about: the belief that sleep is optional, that sleep is negotiable, that somehow we can borrow against it indefinitely. Stay up later, wake up earlier, push harder, drink more caffeine, keep going. Maybe for a while that works, until it doesn't, because eventually biology collects its debt. And when it does, the consequences can show up almost anywhere. Hormones, mood, weight, immune function, cognition, memory, cardiovascular health, even our perception of reality. Which brings us back to the question we started with. If sleep is one of the most important biological processes in the human body, why are researchers spending so much time trying to improve it? Why are scientists studying melatonin, circadian rhythms, sleep architecture, and increasingly, sleep-supporting peptides? Because the more we learn about sleep, the more it appears to influence almost every system in the human body. And that brings us to one of the most interesting questions in modern peptide medicine. If sleep sets at the foundation of human health, what happens when we try to optimize it? Welcome to the strange world of sleep peptides, including 2 compounds many of you have been asking about for months: DSIP and epitalon. The sleep peptides. So after hearing all of this, you might be asking a very reasonable question. If sleep is so important, why are researchers spending so much time trying to influence it? Why are scientists studying sleep architecture, circadian rhythms, melatonin, and increasingly, peptides? Because if sleep deprivation can affect everything from hormone production to immune function to mood to memory, and perhaps even our homicidal tendencies, then improving sleep becomes a very interesting area of research. The answer is surprisingly simple, because sleep appears to influence almost everything: hormones, memory, immune function, metabolism, recovery, mood, inflammation, and even longevity. And when one biological process affects that many systems, people start paying attention. One of the most discussed sleep-related peptides is something called DSIP, which stands for Delta Sleep Inducing Peptide, a compound first identified decades ago and named because of its apparent relationship to deep sleep patterns. Now, before the internet gets carried away, it's important to understand that DSIP remains controversial as it currently sits with many of its friends on the FDA's dreaded Category 2 list. Some studies have suggested potential effects on sleep quality, stress responses, and nervous system regulation. Others have produced less impressive results. And despite decades of interest, many questions remain unanswered. But DSIP continues to attract attention because it sits at the intersection of several fascinating areas of biology: sleep, stress, recovery, and neurological function. Part of the reason DSIP continues to generate interest is that people aren't necessarily looking for sedation. They're looking for restoration. There's a difference. Most people struggling with sleep don't simply want to be unconscious. They want to wake up feeling rested. And many of the conversations surrounding DSIP center around questions like, can it improve sleep quality? Can it help calm an overactive nervous system? Those questions remain controversial because, well, no one really knows the answers. But they're also the reason interest in DSIP has never completely gone away. Because the truth is, DSIP is famous largely because of what it might be, not because it has produced the kind of dramatic results that make peptides like BPC 157 or GLP-1s famous. Then there's epitalon, a synthetic peptide modeled after compounds associated with the pineal gland, the tiny structure in the brain most people know because of its relationship to melatonin and circadian rhythm regulation. Epitalon has gained interest not only for sleep, but also for aging and longevity. Researchers have explored potential effects on melatonin production, circadian signaling, cellular aging, and telomere biology. Now, as with many peptides, there are still plenty of unanswered questions, and separating legitimate science from internet mythology can sometimes be challenging. But the underlying idea is fascinating. If the body's biological clock influences nearly every system we care about, what happens when we support that clock? That's part of what makes epitalon so interesting, because researchers aren't simply asking whether people can sleep longer. They're asking whether improving circadian signaling could potentially influence recovery, aging, hormone function, and overall health. In other words, the conversation isn't really about sleep. The conversation is about everything sleep affects. And then there are the growth hormone secretagogues, compounds like CJC1295 and ipamorelin. Sermorelin and tesamorelin are also in that group. While these aren't typically thought about as sleep peptides, they can highlight an important biological reality. Much of our natural growth hormone release occurs during sleep. Not while we're working, not while we're exercising, not while we're scrolling social media at midnight. While we're sleeping. And for those of you familiar with peptides like CJC1295 and ipamorelin, this is where things become especially interesting, because many people focus on growth hormone, recovery, body composition, performance. But much of that biology is occurring during sleep, which means one of the most powerful recovery tools available isn't a peptide at all. It's getting enough sleep for those biological processes to happen naturally. And honestly, that may be the biggest lesson in all of peptide medicine. People often look for the shortcut, the optimization, the hack, the newest compound, the newest injection, the newest protocol. But many of the biological systems we're trying to optimize already have a built-in foundation. And that foundation is sleep. Because no peptide, no supplement, and no medication can fully compensate for a brain that never gets the restorative sleep it requires. No amount of optimization can replace a missing foundation. Now, before we wrap up, there's one final question I think this story forces us to ask. Not about peptides, not about insomnia, not even about the case itself, but about something much bigger. What happens when a society starts treating sleep as optional? Sacrificing sleep. So, where does all of this leave us? A sheriff, a judge, a courtroom, a phone call, and a question that a jury will eventually have to answer. Was 7 days without sleep enough to fundamentally alter the way one man experienced reality? Ultimately, that's not a question any of us can answer. That decision belongs to a jury of 12 of his peers, and the facts will continue to be argued long after this episode is over. But maybe that's not the most important question. Maybe the more important question is much closer to home. Because while most of us will never experience 7 consecutive days without sleep, thank God, millions of people are living in a state of chronic sleep deprivation every single day. Not 7 days, not 7 months, 7 years, sometimes decades. We've normalized it. We brag about it. We wear exhaustion like a badge of honor. We celebrate hustle, productivity, the grind, being busy, running on caffeine, running on adrenaline, running on willpower, as though sleep is somehow optional, as though biology negotiates. But biology doesn't negotiate. The brain doesn't care about your deadlines. It doesn't care about your inbox. It doesn't care about social media or streaming services or one more episode or one more email or one more scroll before bed. The brain has requirements, and sleep sits near the top of that list. Because while we tend to think of sleep as inactivity, some of the most important work your body performs happens while you're unconscious. Hormones are regulated. Memories are organized. Immune systems recalibrate. Inflammation is controlled. Neural connections are strengthened. Cellular repair occurs. The brain literally clears metabolic waste products that accumulate throughout the day, every night, your entire life. And maybe that's why sleep deprivation is so dangerous. Not because it makes us tired, but because it quietly affects everything. How we think, how we feel, how we react, how we make decisions, how we interpret the world around us, and perhaps how accurately we perceive reality itself. And perhaps that's the real reason hidden in this story. Not what happened in Kentucky, not what happened in a courthouse, not what happened in a courtroom, but what happens when the human brain is pushed beyond its biological limits. Because eventually, every system has a breaking point, including the one sitting between your ears. Most of us will never know what 7 days without sleep feels like. Hopefully, we never find out. But if this story reminds us of anything, it's that the distance between reality and something else entirely may be shorter than we think. The terrifying part? That distance isn't measured in miles. It's measured in biology. So, tonight, when you put down your phone, turn off the television, and finally climb into bed, remember this. Sleep is not a luxury. It is not laziness. It is not wasted time. Sleep is maintenance. Sleep is repair. Sleep is survival. And if there's one thing this story reminds us, it's that the line between reality and a conversation with mommy bones from beyond the grave may be only a few sleepless nights away. I'm Dr. Kristen Lindgren, and thank you for joining me for another episode of the Dysfunction Files. This has been Case 15 in our Medical Mystery File series. If you are interested in learning more about peptides, functional medicine, or therapies that don't always fit neatly inside the conventional medical model, come find us at lindgren.health. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and get some sleep, because you never know how much reality depends on it. I'll see you all for the next one. Bye for now.